But remember that when you construct things, you want to go in a horizontal, almost like cake layers. You want to finish whatever horizontal piece completely, like the facing, and then you would finish the lining and then connect the two. You would never put the front facing on the front lining and then do separately the back facings and back lining and then connect them at the side. You want to go horizontal layers, okay? So with this, the first thing that we need to do with this is connect our facing pieces at the shoulder. We have one front and two back pieces. We need to fully construct that right at the shoulder. Ideally, you want to construct all of your lining pieces and then put your facing on your lining. Now I have it where I'm just using the center front panel and the center back panels because that's the only thing your facings should sew to. Your neckline is going to be very small. We didn't back it off anything other than that 1/4 inch in the truing step. So don't worry if it's very tight on the form. It's going to be really tight. Normally nobody wears their neck that tight, so just know that and expect that.
So should we sew our facing and our lining to our center front and center back before we sew them onto the side seams, or do the outer layer, then the lining, like slash facing, and then sew them together?
Are you asking about the shell, the
Yeah.
outer? So you're going to construct the entire shell by itself, and then you're going to construct the entire lining and then put them together. Should that answer it? So really quickly, I'm going to do this lining, and I was able to do it really quickly while everybody was listening in the previous section. So I'm going to try to do it right here with you guys. And Ashley, feel at your discretion if you want to stop it. But it shouldn't be too long. So on this one I did interfacing. You guys are familiar with interfacing? I did this one with, and then this one's going to be without, so you can see the difference of the structure it lends to it and how necessary it is. But I didn't ask you guys to do that. Everybody's done interfacing? Yeah, okay. So know that it's good to do that dry heat first for like 15 seconds and then a little steam hit. If you do more than that, it starts to degrade the adhesive on it. So I can tell where my center back is because I have a notch right there telling me I have an inch seam allowance. I'm doing a 1/2 inch for my shoulders. Try to do back stitching as much as possible, especially with your lining. If you have a slippery fabric, it'll come loose really easily. It's a good habit to get into taking your foot off the pedal when you're not actually stitching, so you don't accidentally sew your fingers or the fabric when you don't intend to. So that's easy enough. You have your full facing constructed. You want to press these open. You can top stitch them if you like. That's definitely my style. I would do a top stitch on either side of this, just because it looks like it was constructed with more care and time. So a little top stitch down either side. Then once you have your facing done at the shoulders, you're going to take your lining, construct those at the shoulders really quickly. Normally you have to pay a lot more attention to your good side and your bad side, but both of these fabrics are same on either side. And our dress is perfectly symmetrical. So you're gonna have some issues with the lining It's a terrible, terrible fabric, especially if you have something like this, that polyester or the acetate, it will drive you nuts. So if you're getting puckering, or the fabric is trying to go down into the machine, you either need to change your needle size, the tension of your threads, and give it a little bit of help by holding it taut, giving some tension to the fabric, because it will go right down in the machine. So you would also press these. Try to get any wrinkles out or any puckering that happened from the stitching. And iron these open. Really watch the setting on the iron. There's like melted stuff all over the other studio. And this stuff, even on the synthetic setting, it was starting to get weird. So this is going to be your difficult stitch right here. This curve, you're going to be stitching to the opposite curve, or the complete opposite, you know, a concave versus convex. You just want to make sure that you're stitching good to good. Wherever you don't see your seam allowance, line it up where it would normally live once you sew it together, and then flip it down right over good to good, lining up your center front notches. You should have these center front notches in. This is crucial to help line things up. That's the bare minimum that you want. So I got center front in. I'm going to go to my shoulder seams. And then I'm going to line up my center back. And in between there, you have these, again, these opposite curves that you're going to have to distribute. And putting more notches in there when you're patterning is very helpful. So for future projects, if you find this is one of the difficult parts, just throw some more notches in there, help yourself out. Another thing, when you're sewing, you shouldn't look at the cut edges to line your pieces up. If you have a shoulder that comes to a point, it needs to sew to the opposite shoulder. It also comes to a point, but it's a slightly different shape. You should look at the stitch lines and line those up, and not the cut edges. Where are you stitching, and how big is your seam allowance? Keep those things in mind. So at this point, you're just going to throw a good amount of pins in here. And stitch at 1/2 inch. Ashley, you can stop for 2 seconds. If you can remember, put the slippery fabric on top, because that muslin gives it a good structure to prevent it from being poked down into the machine. You guys know the trick about when you're sewing something smaller into like a slightly bigger section, you always put the bigger side close to the machine, and the feeder dog helps it smush into the smaller section. It's good for like stretchy stuff and segments that are bigger than one another or not the same size. Always take your pins out. If it breaks, it can really ruin the machine or hurt you badly. Also, I'm rushing through this, but take your time, at least more than this, because this is really rushed. Any questions while we're getting this seam stitched? No? Does anybody use this machine? Not really? It's got like a stick to it at the beginning. Sticky. Almost done, you guys. It's like the worst fabric ever to sew with. Have you guys been sewing with it?
I've tried it once.
Ugh.
It's really bad. Even with the regular home machine, it's bad.
Yeah. It's crazy. It's worse than just like silks. Remember to try to keep your needle down when you need to adjust stuff and lift your presser foot. So you can keep your spot and it doesn't jump a skip or jump a stitch. Oh man, that's getting skinny. Okay, here we are at the end. Now for these curves, I guess Ashley, if you're not recording, you can start back up again. So these curves, it's crucial that you clip them before you turn them or before you press them, because there's two different curves happening. This first one that wants to curve in on itself. When it curves in on itself, it has to be the wedges that you take out, the triangles that take space out of your seam allowance, and it needs to compress, so you need to take space out. When it's the opposite, when it's spreading outward, you just need to do slits so it can open up. So with the facing, we're gonna press all of the seam allowance toward the facing, because otherwise when we clip it, you can see not only the seam allowance layers under there, but you can see the triangles that you clipped out, which is hideous. So just go through, you need a good amount, like this, probably that close to each other. I'm not gonna do all of them. It's really gonna affect the way it looks, but I'm not gonna do it for time's sake. So press it before you take it to the machine. Do top stitch. This one does not have to be close to the edge. It can be like an 8, but you don't want to get too thick with it because it starts to look a little bit crafty. Off our neckline, which this is really simple. It's an easier curve to construct because they're both going the same way. So you don't need as many pins. So we have a really janky top stitch to hold our seam allowance toward the facing. This is only for this side with the lining. We're doing a similar thing on this side, but it's a little bit closer to the seam because you have to make this facing stronger than the shell. It bullies the other side into coming over to it, and so you hide the facing completely. So now we have this section. This is our good side of our lining, which is going to face toward our body. And we also have our shell. What's this? Oh. Everybody understands like how the rest of the lining would be constructed, even though I'm not doing the full.
Yes.
Right? Does anybody not? Because it's just a detached. The seams of our shell and the seams of our lining on the side seams, they have nothing to do with each other. They're not getting sewn. They have their own seam, but they're not getting stitched together. So now we have our shell, our good side. You press your shoulders open. And theoretically, I would finish my entire shell. My entire center back is open. Don't do that yet. We're going to be doing that next week in class. The zipper, the swing tacks, the arms, and the hem. That will all be done on Monday. But I'll send that in a recap email. So now I have my center front, good side of my shell, and I have the good side of my facing and lining set up. So these match each other perfectly, the curve at least. So all I want to do is put one pin at center front, one at the shoulder seam, one at center back, and then the other side as well. You can put more pins obviously, but because the curves are the same, they won't fight you, and they'll sort of stay where they need to while you're stitching it. Stop me at any time if you have any questions or like something's not clear. So we have another 1/2 inch seam allowance right here. Okay, now our facing and our lining, our facing and our shell, they're connected at the neckline. This is going to be a very small neckline. Did we already talk about that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, should look like this then. That's our inside, and it's connected right here to our shell. What we want to do is push all of that seam allowance that we just made toward the facing. So that's going to make the facing the stronger of the two. This needs clipped and pressed before you do this. Again, makes all the difference in how flat it looks and lays. So this is your last stitch, and then your neckline is perfectly finished. So with your understitch, you want to stay like a fat 16th, I would say, is about right. Because the closer it is, there's a sweet spot. It can be too close to where it's ineffective, and then it can be too far away where it's ineffective. But yes, you guys get the point. So you're stitching down that seam allowance to that side. And if you want to look at the finished one, there's one right there. So what questions can you think of? So both sides of your facing will have a stitch on it. And then when you're done with that stitch, you go to the iron, fold that over, help it fold over that turn of cloth if it needs it. Allow it to have that little tiny turn of cloth at 16th, because now you have no idea what's going on in the inside from looking on the outside. And it's all because of that understitch, making that facing stronger than the front.
Should we trim the interior seam allowance on the seam that's understitched?
Yeah, so you can, especially if you have interfacing like this one, it adds a lot of bulk. So one way to do it is by beveling that seam, and the inside seam, the one that's folded and closed in there, you can cut down to an 1/8, or I mean, can't really get much smaller than that, or 1/4. And it will get rid of a little bit, but as far as cutting the entire seam allowance down, I wouldn't, because it makes it much easier to flip over to the other side when you're stitching it with the understitch. So leave it full length, 1/2 inch, but clip into it.
Okay.
But that's what you're gonna get. And what else? Yeah, everything gets hidden. See how it's sandwiched? All of our work that we did is sandwiched in there. So if it doesn't look like that, you did something wrong along the way, okay?